Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for our 10th year, or year 9, right? For this meeting, which I wanted to thank Elisa for. Every year she's put together a day before meeting with the newborn screening programs, and it started out small but is getting bigger. I think it's sort of leveled out now where people are on the call, and it's a little less what it used to be, but it's there's still a lot of lively discussions. And what I am going to go over is a little bit of what we talked about yesterday, just to bring everyone up to date. This is a disclaimer just for my purposes of the state. It's a summary of the discussion, so it wasn't approved by my state management. So this is going to sound like a repeat, but of what Jerry just said, but it's been 9 years since the ALD got on the RUSP. And it was largely through Alicia's efforts and many other people. And it's amazing how fast time has gone by. New York State, we've been screening since very end of 2013, so we're now into our over 10 years of screening. Sorry, not going in the right direction. Can you see that? Damn. Okay. Had to use a different technique. So this is another repeat of Jerry's slides, but yeah, in 10 years, from very few states to now all but 4 states, and well, those are well on the way to being screening as well. So yesterday's meeting, there were 16 state lab participants, and some other people were there as well. The states, mostly what we were looking for from states is to get updates on their screening stats, how many babies they've screened, how many boys they've detected, how many girls they've detected, and then what other diseases they've picked up through screening. It's been interesting to hear some of this, how states have quite varied incidence rates, and some, but everybody's pretty consistently picking up boys and girls at this point. And it's we're starting to see where individuals are becoming symptomatic in some of the states that have been screening for a while. So some of the discussions, I provided a case review of some examples of individuals who have become symptomatic in New York, and have led us to draw some conclusions. We'll go over a little bit of that just to bring people up to date. There was we always talk about the difference between when you first get a newborn diagnosed with ALD. The difference is they're asymptomatic, and one of the things that makes newborn screening difficult is maybe predicting who would develop disease. So we always are concerned we're picking up people that might not develop disease, but we're even more concerned that we would miss people. So that's a large part of the discussion. And typically in newborn screening, we know very soon whether an individual would have disease we're screening for, but with ALD, the symptoms are so much later, there's this delayed response. So it makes it a more difficult thing for us to get a handle on. So that's one of the, I guess, our biggest things is discussing those kinds of patients and how are we going to avoid picking up individuals that will not need to be followed. It's probably the toughest problem for newborn screening labs. So states provided their basic updates. I'm not going to summarize it as much today because we had a fair number of states that were, I guess we got to them too late. Our call was scheduled for 3 hours, and there was a large number of participants that were on the web call, the Zoom call. Next time, we'll check with them first so they can move on if they would like. We always talk about these kinds of variants we're finding in ABCD1 gene and what they might mean. We talk about what the screening results are, how low or high they are relative to what our population averages look like. And then talk also about Stefan Kemp, who's not here this year, as he says he'll be back next year. He's got the ALD variant database, and this database is Anybody can get to it. If you Google the ALD variant database, it'll come up. If you know the variant that's been picked up through screening, it'll tell you a lot about that. He's been curating this kind of single-handedly and probably with some help from his grad students for somewhere probably on the order of at least 15 or 20 years. So it's an amazing database. There's nothing like it in newborn screening world. So one of the things we always talk about is having individual state labs make sure that they put any data they can into that database. And I'll talk a little bit about why as we get further into this. One of the things that's come up this year is and it was also last year, maybe the year before, people with some of the newer technology are picking up a lot more positives when they do first-tier screening. And that's usually the bigger states. And what we're finding is that the more sensitive instruments seem to have higher interferent levels being read, which means more second-tier testing, and that's causing some states problems with trying to keep up with the volume and things of that sort. And it does have some of us concerned that maybe we might miss some of the lower level concentration babies that get caught up in this. So this is something that will over time probably fix itself. I think most people know about MLD screening might be coming in the future, and that will require states to maybe be able to do ALD screening with MLD screening using a technique where that problem goes away. So some of the typical what we're findings of the newborn screening, we find, of course, the usual ALD cases, but there have been several the Cardi-Gutierrez cases, syndrome cases picked up, which was something nobody thought we'd pick up with screening for ALD. We're seeing paroxysmal disorders, a lot of Zellweger cases, and some other cases we can't really understand, non-paroxysmal disorder, and it just elevations of marker, but no real explanation. So this is just to bring people back, and it's a reminder of two things. The big reminder is these samples, you can see some of them. This is an accession number in the date of at the beginning. Here's a 1999 baby. So back 10 years ago, when we got started, Elisa was able to get us a list of babies that had individuals who had ALD, were confirmed with diagnosis of ALD, and we could go back to our newborn screening cards. And all of those some of them were Zellweger cases, but if you look at the concentrations and kind of point out this, the lowest level was 0.78 in the newborn screening cards. We had another baby that was now another child that was almost 8 years old that had a value of 0.48, and that's the number that kind of made New York stick with a 0.4 cutoff. But that 0.4 cutoff quite a bit lower, but that's how we always start newborn screening. We don't want to miss anybody, so we make conservative cutoffs. But it leads us into a path of maybe detecting things we don't want to, but this is what happens when we're trying to be conservative. Just the cutoff, the newborn screen algorithm, and most states that are doing first tier and second tier testing will have a similar algorithm where they run samples, and if they're positive, then run a subset of that samples through what's called LC, or liquid chromatography mass spec. That process gives very accurate results, and most states' results will compare, but this first tier test is really largely just looking for anybody with the highest levels and skimming those people off the top to go to second tier testing. Most states, or many states, will have a borderline category where they'll ask for a repeat if the sample's sort of elevated but not really elevated. Those come back. If they're still elevated, then those would be referred. This is kind of a standard. Our people's cutoffs and levels will change a little bit from state to state, but it's kind of the same mindset. So when you do this, one of the things in our state lab, if you go back to those samples that were from our archives, they're very elevated and they kind of stand out like a sore thumb. But typically what we see is a lot of this and then a little bit of a high one. And then when you have a really elevated one, it will stand out. And those ones, you almost always say that, that's probably a case. And it turns out that now that we've been screening for so long, we've got follow-up information, and these are examples of symptomatic patients. And I've got what their clinical symptoms were: cerebral ALD with adrenal ALD. And I point out that the concentrations are very elevated, 0.9, 1.1. There's a child that's on, it's labeled as ALD, likely pathogenic variant. And one of the things we do whenever we get a case is we go to the database I told you about, the ALD variant database, and look it up. And we see some correlation with, often when babies got very elevated marker and a variant that's been reported in the literature that's been described with cerebral ALD. And so this is kind of the higher range babies mostly and symptomatic. Same with this, they're still all very elevated concentrations, similar kind of findings in the ABCD1 variant database. Then we get down into what are the borderline range babies, and this is where things get fuzzier, and Stefan calls it the gray zone project, which if you were here last year, you would have heard something about, and that project's still going on, and it's where if a baby's got one of these variants that's really not well understood, there's a program where they can actually try to evaluate the functionality of that baby's blood through their testing. And so if anybody needs information on that, look me up or look Stefan up, and it can make sure you get that information. But when we get into this range, one of the things we see in his database is that it's a variant that's been seen several times in newborn screening, but that no one's been, as of yet, determined to have clinical symptoms. And this is the stuff that we're most interested in, because which way are these going to go? Are these variants just causing some elevation in markers that we look at in our tests that are the high end of a normal level, or are they the low end of somebody who might develop disease? And there's overlap in that, and so that's what makes this tricky. So far in New York and in other states where I've gotten some information, we see very elevated concentrations of our marker, the C26 lysophosphatidylcholine. And it's very similar in our state anyways to what we saw with those archived specimens. The moderate range, we find a lot more uncertainty, but there's some babies that are found to have adrenal functions that are somewhat abnormal. And there was a lot of discussion yesterday and I believe Dr. Riegelman will go over this in her talk, but there's a lot of discussion about what's it mean, when do you become actually symptomatic with adrenal function, and how do you think about that? And that's a tricky problem as well, because the data of a newborn period isn't so clear. So it takes some time, and it takes time also for things to settle down with maybe the functionality of the baby's adrenal gland as they get older. So what we see in the borderline cases are many variants that are in this VUS, which is a variant of uncertain significance, and very few that have had any associated with disease. So a lot of programs we're emphasizing to put their data into this database, and hopefully over time there'll be a way where we can, as a group that discusses these things, say when are these variants become likely a benign variant. It's going to be a matter of time and frequency for how many we see. At what point, if we see 50 of them if we see the same variant 50 times in 5 or 10 years and nobody's ever developed disease, then, is that the magic number? I don't know, but at some point we'll come up with that magic number. So this is just more of the same observations and to contribute to the database. So some other discussions yesterday when we got in, going over this data is, Elisa's got an ALD incidence project that we're making. She's reached out to every state that's doing screening, and we're trying to get just basic numbers. How many babies have you screened? How many boys? How many girls? And how many other detected? And this is going to go into what we're aiming for a screening journal. It's an international journal of neonatal screening, and getting this information in there as to what are the rates for picking up different for each of the different states, and just try to kind of categorize and get that information out there. We also talked about the dried blood spot retention. That's I don't know if many of you know, but there's been 3 or 4 states that have had lawsuits against them. I won't name them if they want to talk about it, they can, but these states, couple of states have been made to throw away their dried blood spot specimens and not keep them for any length of time, any longer than a couple of years. So many states are proactively trying to keep them from coming after them, throwing away all their samples. So I can tell you in New York, we're in the process of removing most of ours. We'll keep 10 years worth of baby samples, which is kind of it's a tragedy to have to do, but we'd rather have 10 years and maybe keep them away, and rather than have to go to have somebody tell us to do only 2 years worth of savings. So we'll see how this works out. But again, it's Lisa in her efforts to try to save specimens. A lot of it's about education and trying to fight back with these lawsuits. We also we talked about what else could be done with it. There was an idea of maybe, could states provide a sample that goes to the parent, so the parent would have a sample, and then they keep it and kind of with their baby's lock of hair or whatever, and then someday down the road, if there was that baby, when that family had more of a need to go back to that specimen, then it would be there and they could donate it for use. The other ideas was to try to have states have a consenting process to keep the specimens for longer than the length of time that they might be keeping them now, just because this is all about privacy issues, and everybody's really concerned with the government having a baby's DNA. And it's kind of a vocal minority, but they've won. They've got people behind them that have made it hard to win a case in court. So this is what's been we've been fighting, and we don't want to. Everybody wants to save newborn screening from getting into that kind of a boat. The other thing Jerry mentioned, there was concerns with the group that oversees how conditions are added to the panel is not even meeting right now. That group was actually going to be voting on whether to add MLD to the screening panel, which is metachromatic leukodystrophy, another similar disease where there's demyelination, like with the ALD. And that was going to be due for a vote in May, and that right now that's totally up in the air as to what will happen. So for now, what I'd like is there anybody from the states that would like to comment about anything I might have missed? If so, just let me know. And if not, that's my summary from yesterday. And thanks very much. And thank you, Elisa, again.